All right, welcome back to the Net to Net podcast. I'm your host, Sam Kelty, and today we're going to be talking about college football. It's rivalry weekend coming up this Thanksgiving weekend, and there's some big implications to see who goes to their conference championship game. So let's dive in. There's a lot to unload. This is when players are going to make their final case for the Heisman. This is team's going to lock in their spot for the college football playoffs and the conference championship. So let's jump right in. So starting off this week on Friday, we got some big matchups and the likes of, first, let's look at Oklahoma and Texas. Oklahoma still has a chance to make it to the college football, or not college football playoffs, but conference championship, which can hang in the balance of Texas. So for Oklahoma to get in to college football, or not college, the Big 12 championship game, is if they can take down TCU and hope that Oklahoma State fall short this weekend against BYU with the upset as well, to potentially play Texas in the Big 12 championship. So Oklahoma needs to push out a win against TCU. On Friday, we also have Iowa versus Nebraska. Iowa's already booked their ticket to the Big 10 championship, and now they await the winners of Ohio State, Michigan, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Later on in the episode, rounding out the later games, we have Missouri playing Arkansas, number 9, Missouri, pretty much just playing for a 10-win season. What Missouri's done this year has been pretty incredible. What we've seen from them, 9-2, about to have a 10-win season. Drinkwitz has done a phenomenal job this year with this Missouri team. Honestly, they were pushing. What we've seen out of some of these guys have looked pretty good. They will be playing in a good bowl game at the end of this year, but unfortunately, they are out of the SEC championship game, which is pretty much a lock between Alabama versus Georgia. No one else will push for that game. And in the later game, we also have Tulane keeping their bowl games alive. Number 23, Tulane, should get the job done against UTSA. And then later we have Texas versus Texas Tech. If you're a Kansas State fan, you're hoping that, if you're a Kansas State fan or an Oklahoma fan, you are hoping that Texas falls short against Texas Tech, which would catapult Oklahoma into the Big 12 championship game, as well as Kansas State, depending on how Oklahoma State does as well. So it could be interesting. We've seen we've seen Texas struggle without Quinn Ewers. They got wins, but they did not look good. And then you lose one of the best running backs in the country, and Jonathan Brooks, who has had a phenomenal season. You're missing that attack on the ground due to injury. They have a chance. So the best team in the Big 12, I think. They have one loss, and that was to Oklahoma. They might have the best win in college football right now. People might say Florida State has it, but I think it's you beat Bama early in the season. Yes, you lose Jonathan Brooks, who's having a phenomenal season, over 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns, pretty good. Quinn Ewers hasn't looked great. He's been hurt a few times, but he could be good. He is returning next year, so that should be good for Texas. Not good for Arch Manning, but if Bama wins, let's say hypothetically Bama wins the SEC, Texas can go in and say, hey, we have the best win of the season against the SEC champs in Bama, which I don't know if that will happen. And then the late game, you have number 6 Oregon taking on number 16 Oregon State. This is pretty much the winner of the. If Oregon wins, they book their ticket into the Pac-12 championship and get another crack at Washington. Washington, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but we're talking about an Oregon Ducks team who, honestly, other than Georgia, have played very well all season. Yes, they have that one loss to Washington, and they lost by field goal. But if you look at it, um, they're 2-1 against the AP polls. They're 2-1 against USA's top polls. They've looked total points. They have 338. They've looked pretty much unstoppable. We've seen last week. Yes, they did play a struggling Arizona State team, but you're talking about Bo Nix, who had 6 touchdowns in the first half, who is pretty much could be a lock right now as the number one Heisman rated player right now. What he's done over this season. We're talking about over 3,000 yards. We're talking about 35 touchdowns to 2 interceptions. He's only been sacked 5 times. And he also has 5 on the ground running. So we're talking about a guy that has 40 touchdowns right now. And then we have Bucky Irving, who's had an unbelievable season, 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns. Jordan James put in 600 with 9 touchdowns as well. Great running back duo. And we're even talking about a guy that we also haven't even seen really play right now, and Noah Whittingham. So you still have him as well. That could do something. So you have some great running backs in your court. And then we're talking about a guy that's popped off this year, Troy Franklin, 13 touchdowns, over 1,000 yards. He's been the favorite target of Bo Nix. And talk about his adopted brother, Tez Johnson, 805 yards, 9 touchdowns. Bo Nix is having an unbelievable season. He's the most. He has the most starts as the quarterback in all of college football. Oh, he's looked unbelievable. I think the only person that you could say that's having a better season is Jayden Daniels, which they are a 3-loss team, they are not in contention of going to the SEC championship or even go to the college football playoffs, which could hurt Jayden Daniels at the end of the season when we vote for this Heisman, because we look at what Bo Nix and Michael Penix Jr. or Marvin Harrison could potentially have, which could hurt them. And then we talk about some of the big games during rivalry weekend. Probably the biggest game of all time rivalry in college football: Ohio State, Michigan. Number 2 versus number 3. No Jim Harbaugh. Jim Harbaugh is not going to be coaching at the Amazing Blues, this year at Ann Arbor, which could hurt them because we've seen them kind of struggle without Jim Harbaugh on the sidelines. We saw it against Penn State. They couldn't throw the ball, so they had to just run the ball the entire time. They did not look good against Maryland. They looked like they were struggling. And I think Jim Harbaugh, with his presence there, will hurt them. But we're talking about a complete team. And Michigan, with J.J. McCarthy, Blake Corum, yes, they are a little banged up. We'll see what happens. They did lose their top receiver in Roman Wilson due to injury in the Maryland game, which could be bad. So hopefully they are healthy going into this game, because without him, I think they're going to struggle throwing the ball even more, even without Jim Harbaugh being there. And we're talking about J.J. McCarthy over the last 2 games. 12 of 23, 141 yards, 0 touchdowns, 1 interception, and a 52 completion rate. And then against Penn State, he only threw the ball 8 times for 60 yards. Those 2 games are once Jim Harbaugh was gone. So we're talking about those 2 games. They've struggled to win, and they've been close, 24-15, 31-24. They've been close down to the wire, and you don't have a Jim Harbaugh there, which, like I said, could not help them. And then we talk about an Ohio State team. Ohio State. Offense has been very inconsistent over the season. Let's just be real. They have been very inconsistent this season. Yes, they're 11-0. Yes, they have a Penn State win, and they have a Notre Dame win. But outside of that, Kyle McCord has struggled in certain games against good teams, good pass rushing teams. Travion Henderson hasn't been healthy pretty much all season, and when he's been healthy, he's been amazing. But when you take him out of the equation, they lose that run game. They lose one of how they can take pressure off of Kyle McCord, how they can lean on Travion Henderson. Him being healthy going into this game is very key. Then we talk about the receiving core. Marvin Harrison Jr., the go-to. How can Michigan stop Marvin Harrison? Answer, they can't really. You're going to have to double team him. But then you leave Mbuka or a Kate Stover wide open. Mbuka, yes, hasn't been fit all season, but last game he looked very good. We're talking about the leading receiver in last week's game against Minnesota. He had 5 receptions, 83 yards, 0 touchdowns. Yes, he's coming back from injury. Hopefully he'll be fresh for the Buckeyes because they will need him to take the pressure off of Marvin Harrison Jr. Then we have Kyle McCord, which I've been saying. He has struggled. He struggled against Wisconsin. He had 3 turnovers, 1 fumble, 2 interceptions, but he did have 2 touchdowns. He didn't look great against Penn State. He looked inexperienced. And then he goes up against Minnesota, Michigan, and Rutgers, who are not very good teams, and then beats them. Can Kyle McCord do something that C.J. Stroud never did and beat Michigan? Can we see that happen this year? It's a possibility. This is one of the most 2 hated teams that hate each other. This will be a very fun game. It will be ugly. There's probably going to be some fights. In this situation, I like Michigan just because the fact is that Ohio State's offense struggles against a good defense. And we saw that against Penn State. We saw that against Notre Dame. Michigan has a great defense. It's just, can the offense of Michigan do something without Jim Harbaugh? Can Ohio State's offense be consistent enough to beat Michigan? You're also going into a hostile environment in Ann Arbor. For a guy that hasn't started until this year, that's going to be a big test for Kyle McCord, which, honestly, I could see him taking that step and building off this entire year for this game. But at the same time, Michigan, the more experienced quarterback, the more experienced team right now, I think they're just going to get the job done slightly. I think it's going to come down to 2 minutes, and whoever has the ball with 2 minutes left, and I think Michigan could have that. And then we talk about the later games. Another big game to match up is Alabama-Auburn, number 8 versus Auburn, the Iron Bowl. Bama's pretty much a lock to go to the SEC championship game, which it will be December 2nd, so that should be a good game. And pretty much now we're just hoping there's going to be a lot of things riding on this season for Bama because they are still in contention. We thought they would be out with that loss to Texas. Bama's still in there. Jalen Milroe has looked pretty good since the benching at Texas. He has looked unbelievable. He's playing himself into a Heisman conversation, but probably won't win it because when you look at the Heisman, you talk about a guy that it's pretty much from the start of the season to the end of the season, not start the season and then pick it back up later. It's the continuous process from first game to the last game, and I don't think Jalen Milroe hasn't done it. But it's a good story to see that they're kind of playing into his favor, playing the offense around him to his strengths instead of trying to make him play into a different style. Which Bama, good turnaround at the end of the year. I thought this was going to be a really bad year for Bama for the first time in a while, but it's different. And then we got a matchup later between Wazoo and UW. Washington State versus Washington. It should be a good game. Washington State, Cameron Ward versus Michael Penix Jr. And this season, can Washington State pull up the upset against Washington? Because if that's the case, then you have an interesting fourth place. Does Washington get it? Does Oregon get it? Does Texas get it? Does Bama get it? And that could play into the Pac-12 championship game because Washington honestly has not looked great since their win against Oregon. Yes, they're 11-0. Yes, they've won games. But we're talking about the Arizona State game. They struggled there. No touchdowns from Penix. Their only touchdown was a defense. They struggled last week against Oregon State. They did not look that great. It came down to a couple stops on the defense, but they did not look too great, and they only won by 2 points. We talk about the USC game versus the USC Washington game. They won 52-42, but that game was pretty much close up until the end. Winning by 10. It was a shootout. We talk about the Stanford game. That Stanford game was close. They scored at the end to put themselves ahead, but that game was close. And then we talk about Utah. Utah ran right over them in the first half, and then in the second half, Washington came alive. But can you afford to sleep during one half of a game? You can't, especially in the final season, the final game, and taking that momentum into the Pac-12 championship, which Washington needs to pick it up if they want to become Pac-12 champions and book themselves a place into the college football playoffs. Then we have later on Georgia versus Georgia Tech. Should be a good game. Georgia should win this game easily, but you never know. Georgia Tech could pull the upset. Same thing with Florida State, Florida. Let's see how Florida State does without Jordan Travis. That was a gruesome injury if you were watching that game. They are now headed into in-state rivalry between Florida and Florida State. And like I said, without Jordan Travis, who has been their leader, has been their quarterback all season, and you're going into the game with Tate Rodemaker, the junior out of Georgia. Can he step up? We saw him throw 2 touchdowns. We saw him throw 2 touchdowns in the win against Northern Alabama. He was 13 of 23, 2 sacks, 217 yards. Not bad for a guy that came in and has to replace a guy like Jordan Travis. Can Florida Gators pull up the upset against the 11-0, the number 4 ranked team in the country? Or sorry, 5th ranked team in the country. Can they go in and win? It will be interesting. Florida State has to go to Ben Hill Griffith Stadium in Florida. It's not in Tallahassee. It's in Gainesville. It'll be a very hostile environment, especially for a new quarterback coming in. Can Florida prepare enough to throw Florida State off the game, and then, or can Florida State go 12-0, and then they look to Louisville in the ACC championship game, which should be a good game. It's already booked. So Louisville pretty much can be, if they beat Kentucky or they lose Kentucky, they're still going to be playing in the ACC championship game. They are the second best team behind Florida State this year. It should be a good game. And then you have the rivalry, Notre Dame, Stanford game. Always a good game. Sam Hartman's last game in college football. So it should be a good game. Hopefully, we get Sam Hartman puts on a show, Audrey Gaston puts on a show, and that Notre Dame defense. They've been kind of inconsistent this year with wins and losses, but could bounce back against Stanford, a struggling Stanford team. And then the last game to point out is the Kansas State Iowa State, which I mentioned earlier. Will have implications in an open Big 12 championship game. It's wide open at this point. It's a very close neck and neck. It should be an interesting thing. Can Kansas State put themselves into that conversation of being in a Big 12 championship game against the likes of Texas or the likes of Oklahoma, whoever makes it? It's like I mentioned, it is up for grabs in the Big 12, and we're talking about Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas State, Oklahoma State. Those 4 teams could all be in contention, and 2 of them will make it. Can Texas make it? Can Oklahoma State make it? Can Oklahoma make it? They all have and Kansas State. They all have chances to make it. I think Kansas State could propel themselves over Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. I think it's a real possibility. I think Oklahoma against a good TCU defense, who we've seen decently over this course of the season, and then we talk about Oklahoma State, who's been good but not great. BYU is a good defense as well. This Big 12 conference is up for grabs, and especially the last year with Texas and Oklahoma in it, they probably want to go out with a bang. Will Oklahoma play Texas, and will Texas get another shot at beating Oklahoma? Texas has one loss on the season, and that is to Oklahoma. Will they get another crack at them? There is a good possibility. And then we talk about my team, UC Bearcats. Unfortunately, not the best season this year. 1-7 in the conference, 3-7 overall, 3-8 overall. Final game against Kansas. We'll see a few guys play their last games, like Ryan Montgomery and maybe Dante Corleone if he goes to the draft. Juwan Briggs. There's a lot of people. Malik Van could be seeing their last in a Bearcat uniform. Hopefully, at Nippert can get a win. It is a 7:30 game against Kansas, who Kansas has been good this season. They're 4-7, 7-4. They've had some good wins. They beat Oklahoma this year, so you never know what Kansas is going to bring to them. So yeah, this is Rivalry Week. A lot of implications going into this season, into this final week before conference championship games. And then speaking of conference championship games and speaking of the college football playoffs. So the college football rankings came out this week. And we talk about teams that made it. We're talking about Georgia at 1, which is very obvious. Georgia has been the best team. I think Carson Beck's kind of finally came into his own. He played very well without Brock Bowers, and he looked like a true leader. Let's see what he can do. Georgia has been the best team, I think, all season, and they're showing why they are the defending champions. They have to be number 1. Number 2, Ohio State and Michigan at 2 and 3. This one's interesting because we're talking about Ohio State, who has 2 wins against against ranked opponents, and we talk about Michigan, who has 1 win against a ranked opponent right now. How is Washington not in second? We're talking about a team that has beaten the number 11 team, has beaten then number 18 Utah, then number 20 USC. Yes, USC and Utah are no longer ranked, but they're also number 1 in strength of schedule metric. They have played teams that were ranked at the time and beaten them. They should be right now. I would have them ranked over both Ohio State and Michigan because if we look at the eye test, yes, Washington hasn't looked good. But we talk about if we go off her records against who they played, against ranked opponents, against who they played. Washington has played better opponents than Ohio State and Michigan. They should be over them. And we also look at Florida State, number 4 in strength of record metrics. But I think they took that into account with losing Jordan Travis last week. I think they look at it as, okay, how is Florida State going to look with Tate Rodemaker at the starting quarterback instead of Jordan Travis? Because I think if Jordan Travis didn't get hurt and is still there, they would be ahead of Washington. So it will be interesting to see how this plays all out. Because if Washington loses and Florida State get upset, if Washington and Florida State get upset this week, then it is 1 loss team. It's 3 undefeated teams and then 1 loss. And then you take into account that Michigan plays Ohio State, so one of them has to be a loss and one of them will be undefeated. So you will have 2 undefeated teams, and the rest could be either 1 losses or undefeated, if that makes sense. And then when it comes down to the conference championship, then it's all hell breaks loose between certain teams. We talk about Ohio State. If they beat Michigan, they play Iowa. Same thing with Michigan. They'll play Iowa in the conference championship, which I think the winner of the Big Ten will be the number 2 seed behind Georgia. I don't see Georgia losing to Bama, and I see potentially Georgia repeating. Then it comes down to Florida State. Florida State's team, yes, they beat yes, they beat LSU. Yes, they beat well, they haven't beat Louisville yet, but still, you're talking about a team that might have one of the maybe the second best win in college football. I still think Texas beating Alabama in Tuscaloosa trumps their win against LSU at the beginning of the season. But yes, you have wins against Clemson, wins against Notre Dame. Sorry, not Notre Dame. Win against Duke. Win against LSU, like I said. Win against Miami and Pitt, Wake Forest, Clemson. And then you have that win against Louisville, which I don't know how that will look in the eyes of the committee without Jordan Travis. I think they would have to kill Louisville in the ACC championship to even make us chance. I could see them missing out. We talk about um, we talk about Oregon and Washington. Pac-12 is up for grabs at this point. Yes, Washington is undefeated. Yes, though probably will be Washington State and play Oregon in the Pac-12 championship. I think Oregon is a better team overall than Washington right now. And the way we're seeing it is we've seen after Washington beat Oregon, we've seen Washington's performance start to dip. But when we've seen Oregon after that loss, it's pretty much been on the rise. And Oregon and Bo Nix, they just look better and better every single week. Not to take any credit away from Washington, they haven't looked great. Their defense has been pretty good with Braylon Trice and ZTF and those boys in the back and Muhammad in the back. But their offense needs to step up. Dylan Johnson has stepped up, but they've struggled. We've seen them when getting pressured on Michael Penix, putting someone into his face to get him pressure. He struggles. We saw that against Oregon. We saw that against Utah. We saw that against USC. Getting pressure to him struggles because then he has to rely on throwing it into double coverage, throwing it to a guy that's not open. He underthrows his receiver or overthrows. And we've seen that from time to time against good defenses that he's played. But I will say Washington has one of the best trios, I think, in college football with Odunze. And we haven't seen Jalen McMillan because he's just been injured. But then you have Jalen Polk, and Tersh Bernard, and Dylan Johnson. On paper, they are really good. They are probably better than Oregon on paper. But if we look at the eye test, they just have not been good since they played Oregon. And Oregon has looked good ever since they lost. So I agree with Oregon being the best one-loss team in the rankings behind Texas and Bama. I see that they honor Texas beating Bama. They're ahead. Louisville is 10-1, but they have Missouri ahead. That one, it doesn't make a ton of sense just in the fact that if we're honoring wins against certain teams and we're honoring that they are a one-loss team, shouldn't Missouri be below Louisville? Yes, Louisville has knocked off certain teams, and they've knocked off Duke. They've knocked off their biggest one probably of the season. Has to be Notre Dame. I think probably their best. That would be honestly their best one. Missouri, on the other hand, they played Georgia. They got embarrassed, and it wasn't too bad. 30-21, not terrible. And then they lose to LSU by 10. So yes, they have two good losses. They beat Tennessee, who is very inconsistent. Outside of that, I don't see why. Yeah, Kansas State maybe, but that was only by 4. It's just yes, you have 2 wins, you have 3 wins against ranked opponents, 2 losses against ranked opponents. And then we're talking about a Louisville team who beat Indiana. who beat Notre Dame, who beat Duke. Yes, they lost to Pitt, which they probably shouldn't have, but they're one loss. They played at Big Ten Indiana and beat them. They played an Indiana team who almost beat the Buckeyes. And we're talking about Indiana who had to play Ohio State early on in the season. It was 23-3. Yes, the score doesn't reflect how bad Ohio State played and the defense of Indiana and the weather and the conditions. But yes, you played a Louisville team. Louisville has two. They both have 2 wins against ranked opponents, but Missouri has 2 losses and Louisville has 1. So how is a 9-2 team better than a 10-1 team? And what Louisville has done this season is phenomenal. Give them props to what they've done. They look great. So we're talking about going into this matchup and going into the ACC championship game. Louisville, honestly, with losing Jordan Travis, I think Louisville can upset Florida State in the ACC championship game, and it will be interesting to watch. So hopefully that's a good game. And then to finish off this episode, we talk about the Heisman. I think right now the Heisman, my top 3 Heisman favorites has to be Bo Nix at 1. I just think what he's done this season is unbelievable with Oregon. I think he's 1. I think tied with him is Jayden Daniels at 2. He has Jayden Daniels and Bo Nix have gone back and forth this season with playing the best, and honestly, I would put them 1 and 2. Outside of those 2, number 3, I would probably say, if you would be honest, I would probably say Marvin Harrison at 3, just because he's the best non-quarterback player in the country. I think he could be up there. And then behind him, Penix Jr. has to be up there. What he's been doing, I think, has showed why he should be number 2. Or sorry, not number 2, number 4. What he's done all season. And then I would say number 5 would have to be probably go with at number 5 I'd probably have to say Jordan Travis. Jordan Travis has had an unbelievable year. Even though he is injured now, I think he's proven why their team is 12-0 with him and Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson. Without Jordan Travis, I think they would have struggled. But yeah, those are my 5 Heisman. I think that will do it. So that pretty much wraps up our episode today. I will be back with an episode following the rivalry games on Sunday, most likely, and you'll see it either Sunday night or Monday morning. So definitely keep a lookout on that. We'll be releasing a couple more episodes, so definitely keep it on the lookout, and I'll see you guys soon. Peace.